Hi, welcome to the mini story for the Day of the Dead. Okay, let's start.
Okay, here we go. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Oh.
Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala.
I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day
I
of
arrived
the Dead, November
in
1st.
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
AJ's
me,
arrived
AJ.
in Guatemala on the Day
I
of
arrived
the Dead,
in Guatemala
November 1st.
on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I arrived
No,
in Guatemala
I didn't arrive in Guatemala
November 1st.
on November 3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
November 1st. I arrived
November
in
1st.
Guatemala
I arrived
on the Day
in
of
Guatemala
the Dead, November
on
1st.
November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead,
I arrived
November
in
1st.
Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Oh.
I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Oh.
Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I wasn't angry
No,
about
I
this
wasn't
holiday.
angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday.
I wasn't sad about this holiday.
About this holiday.
I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
AJ
I was, AJ.
Curious about
I was
this
curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
This holiday, I was curious
holiday,
about this holiday.
I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead.
Which holiday
I was
I curious about?
The Day of the Dead.
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
I was curious about the
I
Day
was
of
curious
the Dead.
about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So, I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Oh.
Where did I go?
To the cemetery. I went
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery.
I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
AJ went to the cemetery.
AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
To the cemetery.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
November 1st. The Day of the Dead.
November 1st, the Day of the Dead, right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
To see what was
Well,
happening.
to see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
AJ went to the cemetery
AJ, went
to see
to
what
the
was
cemetery
happening.
to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
In Guatemala.
In Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
A holiday. The Day of the Dead
A
is
holiday.
a holiday.
The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead was and is November 1st. Okay. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting.
Oh.
Was it boring?
No, it
No,
was boring.
it wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yes, it was interesting.
It was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel
It was interesting.
about the cemetery?
It was interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The cemetery. The
The
cemetery
cemetery.
was
The cemetery
interesting.
was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting?
The Day of the Dead, November 1st.
It was interesting on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Was the atmosphere very sad?
No, it's like a party.
No, the atmosphere was not sad. The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
The atmosphere.
The atmosphere was happy.
Was happy.
The atmosphere was like a party. What was like a party?
The atmosphere.
The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Where was the atmosphere like a party?
To the cemetery on the Day of the Dead.
In the cemetery.
Guatemala.
Right? The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No, to the cemetery.
No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere.
Okay.
Families were sitting.
Okay, that's it. See you later. Bye bye.